Revelation. We shall now try to find out what was the attitude of the first Christian generations to power. We begin with Revelation. This is one of the most violent texts, and it follows the sayings of Jesus, but with even greater severity. It obviously has Rome in view, but not simply the presence of the Romans in Judea. At the issue is the central imperial power of Rome itself. Throughout the book, there is radical opposition between the majesty of God and the powers and dominions of earth. This shows how mistaken are those who find continuity. God damn it. This shows how mistaken are those who find continuity between the divine power and earthly powers, or who argue, as under a monarchy, that a single earthly power ought to correspond to the one Almighty God who reigns in heaven. Revelation teaches the exact opposite. The whole book is a challenge to political power. I will simply mention two great symbols. The first is that of the two beasts. It takes up a theme of the later prophets, who depicted the political powers of their time as beasts. The first beast comes from the sea. This probably represents Rome, whose armies came by sea. It has a throne that is given to it by the dragon. The dragon, anti-God, has given all authority to the beast. People worship it. They ask who can fight against it. It is given all authority and power over every tribe, every people, every tongue, and every nation. All who dwell on earth worship it. Political power could hardly, I think, be more expressly described, for it is this power which has authority, which controls military force, and which compels adoration. The beast is created by the dragon. We thus find the same relation as that already noted between political power and the Diablos. Confirmation of this idea that the beast is the state may be found in the fact that at the end of Revelation, Great Babylon is destroyed. The beast unites all the kings of earth to make war on God, and is finally crushed and condemned after his main representative has first been destroyed. The second beast rises out of the earth. Specialists have rallied against my interpretation of this beast, but I stand by it. It is described as follows. It makes all the inhabitants of the earth worship the first beast. It seduces the inhabitants of earth. It tells them to make an image of the first beast. It animates the image of the beast and speaks in its name. It causes all, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, so that no one can buy or sell without having the mark of the beast. For my part, I find here an exact description of propaganda in association with the police. The beast makes speeches which induce people to obey the state, to worship it. It gives them the mark that enables them to live in society. Finally, those that will not obey the first beast are put to death. The point is clear enough, I think. One of the main instruments of Roman propaganda was the establishment of the cult of Rome and the emperor with altars, temples, etc. The Jewish kings of the period accepted this. This is why the texts speak of the beasts that rise up out of the earth. The local authorities in the provinces of the Near East were the most enthusiastic promoters of the cult of Rome. This was a kind of power that works on the intelligence and on credibility to obtain voluntary obedience to the beast. But let us not forget that for the Jews who wrote this text, the state and its propaganda are two powers that derive from evil. My second and last symbol is the fall of Great Babylon in chapter 18. There is general agreement that Babylon represents Rome, but it is also clear in the text that Rome is equated with supreme political power. All nations have drunk the wine of the fury of their vices. The first interesting feature is that the fury or violence in evil. All the kings of the earth are delivered up to adultery. Political power is the climax, for earthly kings all lie with it. Merchants are enriched by the power of Babylon's luxury. The state is a means by which to concentrate wealth, and it enriches its clients. We see the same thing today in the form of public works and arms production. Political power makes alliance with the power of money. When Babylon collapses, all the kings of the earth lament and despair, and the capitalists weep. A long list is then given of the goods bought and sold at Rome. But the interesting point is at the end of the list we find that Great Babylon bought and sold human bodies and souls. If the reference were only to bodies, we might think of slaves. But there is also a more general reference to souls. The slave trade is not the issue here. The point is that political authorities have all power over people. What is promised is the pure and simple destruction of political government. Rome, to be sure, yet not Rome alone, but power and domination in every form. These things are specifically stated to be enemies of God. God judges political power, calling it the great harlot. We can expect from it neither justice, nor truth, nor any good, only destruction. At this point, as may be seen, we are far from the rebellion of Jesus against Roman colonization. As Christians became more numerous and Christian thought developed, the Christian view of political power hardened. Only reductionist thinking can see this passage as directed solely against Rome. The hardening might be due to the beginning of persecution, of which the text gives evidence. For the great harlot was drunk with the blood of saints and with the blood of witnesses to Jesus. In the great city was found the blood of prophets and of saints, all of whom had been slain on earth. The reference, of course, is to the slaying not merely of the first Christians, but all the righteous. A remarkable point is according to those who were thus put to death for their Christian allegiance were beheaded. They were not killed in the arena or fed to lions. Power slays not merely Christians, but all righteous people. This experience undoubtedly strengthened the conviction that political power would be condemned. I believe that among the first Christians there was no other global position. At this period, Christianity was hostile to the state. Peter. Before taking a look at Paul, we must glance at a strange passage in the later epistle, namely Peter, which tells us to be subject to the kings as supreme, and to honor the king. Oddly, I forgot to shut off my phone. Oh, shit. Rip microphones. Honor the king. Oddly, this passage has never given commentators any difficulty. As they see it, the matter is simple enough. The king was the Roman emperor. That is all. On this basis, then, sermons are preached on the obedience and submission of Christians to political authorities. Interestingly, in parallel Bibles, there is usually a cross-reference to the saying Jesus that we must render to Caesar what is Caesar's. In fact, however, this whole line of exposition displays great ignorance regarding the political institutions of the period. First, the head of the Roman state was then the princeps. This was the term for the emperor at the time when the Christian texts were written. The period is known historically as the Principiate. The princeps was never called the king. The title was formally forbidden in Rome. We have to realize that Caesar was assassinated on the rumored charge that he was planning to restore the monarchy. That was a good enough reason. Augustus was careful enough never to hint at anything of this kind. He acted very cleverly, simply assuming successively the republican titles of consul, people's tribune, and commander-in-chief. He then took also the title of supreme pontiff, exercising religious functions. All these were traditional titles of Rome's democracy. Augustus also took steps to abolish abnormal institutions that had arisen during the Civil War, for example, the triumvirate and the permanent consulate, and he opposed the creation of a dictatorship. Having taken all power to himself, he was content with the title princeps, or first citizen. The people alone was sovereign, and it was delegated its potestas to the princeps. This delegation was by a regular procedure. To avoid military coup, Augustus had the plenitude of power assigned to the Senate by a democratic vote. He then received some imprecise titles without legal content, for example, father of the country, guardian of the citizens. He was also princeps senatus, first senator. He restored the regular functioning of republican institution. His successors were less scrupulous than he was. Little by little they established the empire, but never in an absolute and totalitarian sense. And they never took the title king. They expressly avoided any reference to this title or any assigning of it to themselves. Hence, the author of Peter can hardly have the emperor in view in this passage. I thus want to make a hazardous suggestion. What follows is pure hypothesis. There were political parties at Rome. During the first century, a strange party evolved on the basis of a global philosophy. This philosophy was as follows. The world's empires have a cyclical life. A political power is born, grows, reaches its height, and then, unable to grow further, inevitably declines, entering a period of decomposition. This applied to all known empires, hence it applied to Rome as well. Many writers of the first century thought Rome had already reached the summit of its power. Its rule stretched from Spain to Persia, from Scotland to the Sahara, and the south of Egypt. It could not expand any more. In consequence, its decline was beginning. After the period of glorification and enthusiasm, such as we see in Virgil and Livy, there thus came a period of dark pessimism among less well-known writers and philosophers. It should be added that whenever one empire collapsed, like Egypt, Babylon, or Persia, a new one arose to take its place. In all probability, this would also happen in the case of Rome. But the Parthians were the only unconquered enemy of Rome, and they were constantly invading new territories. One group, first of intellectuals, then of members of governing class, very seriously envisioned the Roman Empire being replaced by a Parthian empire. Some of them, entering into the flow of history, began to spread these ideas and founded, it is said, a party that would finally support the Parthians. Now the Parthians, for their part, were governed by a king. Some think that prayers were being said for the king, that is, the Parthian king, and that they were forbidden. If we grant this, and some historians of course dispute it, the text in Peter is seen in a new light. There can be no question of honoring the emperor under the name of king, or of praying for the king of Rome. But Peter twice refers to the king. Why then should he not have had the Parthian king in view? If so, this passage is totally a subversive one. But the reference in this case is solely to the political power of Rome and not the state as such. For the author is supporting another power. Nevertheless, the passage is in accord with the general Christian attitude, which is far from being one of passivity or obedience, and which we might classify in three ways. 1. It may be first an attitude of scorn, a refusal to recognize the validity of political power, though not of total rejection. 2. It may be an attitude of total repudiation. It may be an attitude of total repudiation of political power. It may be an attitude of condemnation of Roman power. After the capture of Jerusalem by the Roman armies, the destruction of the temple, the suppression of the autonomy of Jewish government, the massacre of thousands of Jews during the war, and finally the suppression of the Christian church at Jerusalem in AD 70, the Christian hatred of political power clearly came to focus on Rome. Paul. We finally arrive at the passages in Paul. We had first to fix the general Christian climate in order to put the verses in context. What's an appendix? I guess we're almost over. This book's almost. We finally arrived at the passage. We had to first fix the general Christian climate in order to put the verses in context, although they are too well known. I will quote them. First, we have Romans 13, 1-7. Let every person be subject to higher authorities, for there is no authority which does not come from God, and authorities that exist which have been instituted by God. Therefore, one who resists authority resists the order that God has established, and those who resist will bring condemnation on themselves. It is not for good conduct, but for bad, that magistrates are to be feared. The magistrate is the servant of God for your good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for it is not in vain that he bears the sword, being the servant of God, to exercise vengeance and punish those who do evil. It is necessarily, therefore, to be subject not only for fear of punishment, but also for the sake of conscience. It is also for this reason that you pay taxes, for the magistrates are servants of God, attending entirely to this function. Pay to all of them what is their due, taxes to whom you owe taxes, tribute to whom you owe tribute, fear to whom you owe fear, honor to whom you owe honor. We have then Titus 3:1. Remind them to be subject to the magistrates and authorities, to obey and be ready for any good work. These are the only texts in the whole Bible which stress obedience and the duty of obeying authorities. It is true that the two passages show that they were among Christians of the time a counterflow to the main current that we have demonstrated. In 2 Peter 2:10, there is condemnation of those who despise authority. And Jude 8 also condemns those who, carried along by their dreamings, despise authority and revile the glorious ones. We must emphasize, however, that these are very ambiguous texts. What is the authority that they have in view? We must never forget the constant reminder that all authority belongs to God. Finally, we might adduce in 1 Timothy 2:1-2, Therefore I exhort that above all things make prayers supplications, petitions, and thanksgivings for all humans, for kings, and for all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceable and quiet life in all reverence and honesty. In these Pauline texts, we seem to have a trend that differs from one we have just seen. Our next task is to compose a completely incomprehensible, or alas, too comprehensible problem. From the 3rd century AD, most of the theologians, simply forgetting all that we have shown, have focused solely on the statements of Paul in Romans 13 and preached total submission to authority. They have done this without taking into account, as we have done, the context of the statements. They have even fixed on one statement in particular: all power comes from God. This has been leading the theme in 16 centuries of cooperation between church and state. Some bold theologians added per populum by way of the people, but this was a mere detail as compared to the imperious duty of obeying the power that is from God as though it were itself God. The curious thing is to see how these theologians fared when often, to their embarrassment, they had to do with tyrants. A strange casuistry was adopted to explain that power comes from God only when it is gained in a legal, legitimate, and peaceful way, and exercised in a moral and regular way. But this did not call into question the general duty. Even at the time of the Reformation, Luther used this text in the Peasants' War to charge the princes to crush the revolt. As for Calvin, he insisted that kings are legitimate except when they attack the church. So long as authorities let Christians freely practice their religion, they cannot be faulted. As I see it, we have here an incredible betrayal of the original Christian view, and the source of this betrayal is undoubtedly the tendency toward conformity and the ease of obeying. However that may be, the only rule that has been gathered from the vast array of texts is that there is no authority except from God. We shall now try to examine Pauline passages more clearly. As in the case of all biblical texts and other texts, we must first refuse to detach one phrase from the total line of thinking. We must put that phrase in the general context. Let us take Paul's argument as a whole. In Romans 9 through 11, Paul has just made a detailed study of the relations between the Jewish people and Christians. A new development that begins, which will cover chapters 12 through 14, and at the heart of which is passage which we are now considering. The lengthy discussion begins with the words, "Do not be conformed to the present age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." Paul's general and essential command, then, is that we should not be conformists, that we should not obey the trends and customs and currents through society which we live, that we should not submit to the form of them, but that we should be transformed, that we should receive a new form by the renewing of the mind, that is, by starting from a new point, namely, the will of God and love. This is obviously a strange beginning if he is later to demand obedience to political authorities. Paul then goes on to teach at length about love among Christians in the church, love for all people, and love for enemies, not avenging oneself, but blessing those who persecute. And with a further exhortation to live peaceably with all. The passage on the authorities follows next. Then all commandments are summed up in the commandment of love and of doing no wrong to others. Some details are offered as to the practice of love: hospitality, not judging others, supporting the weak. This then is the general framework or movement within which the passage on authority occurs. It seems so odd, so out of joint in this larger context that some exegetes have thought that it must be an interpolation, that Paul himself did not write it. For my part, however, I believe that it has place here and that it does come from the apostle. We have seen that there is a progression of love from friends to strangers and then to enemies. And this is where the passage then comes. In other words, we must love our enemies, and therefore we must even respect the authorities, not loving them, but accepting their orders. We have to remember that the authorities have attained to power through God. Yes, we recall that Saul, a mad, bad king, attained to power through God. This certainly does not mean that he was good, just, or lovable. Along the same lines, one of the best commentators on the passage, Alphonse Mallet, relates it directly to the end of chapter 12. Do not let yourself be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Let every person, therefore, be subject to the higher authorities. In other words, Paul belongs to that Christian church which at first is unanimously hostile to the state, to the imperial power, to the authorities, and in this text he is thus moderating that hostility. He was reminding Christians that the authorities are also people. There was no abstract concept of the state, people such as themselves, and that they must accept and respect them too. At the same time, Paul shows great restraint in this council when he tells them to pay their dues, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue, respect to whom respect, honor to whom honor. We are rightly reminded of the answer of Jesus regarding the text. Far more boldly, Jesus claims that we owe neither respect nor honor to magistrates or the authorities. The only whom we must fear is God. The only whom we must honor as due is God. In an appendix, I will adduce two of the better commentators on this passage. 3 points still call for discussion. The first presents no difficulty. We have met it already. It relates to the paying of taxes. Christians must not refuse to pay them. That is all. The second is more striking. We must pray for the authorities. We have quoted the passage which Paul asked that prayer be made for kings. The plural shows that we cannot expound this as we did in the case of Peter, namely, for those in authority for the government. This verse confirms what I said above. Paul is saying, in effect, that we are to pray for all people, included our kings and those in high office. We are to pray even for kings and magistrates. We detest them, but we are still to pray for them. No one must be excluded from our intercession, from our appeal to God's love for them. It might seem completely crazy, but I knew some German Christians who were in the resistance movement against Hitler, even to the point of plotting his overthrow, and who still engaged in prayer for him. It is not out of place to recall that the only ones to organize resistance to Hitler after 1936 were German Protestants of the Confessing Church. We cannot want the absolute death of political foes. Certainly our prayer will not be a kind of Te Deum. It will not be a prayer that they remain in power, that they win victories, that they endure. It will be a prayer for their conversion, that they can change the way they behave and act, that they renounce violence and tyranny, that they become truthful. Yet we still pray for them and not against them. In Christian faith, we will also pray for their salvation, which is obviously not the same thing as the safety of their kingdom. This prayer must still be made, even if from a human standpoint there is no hope of change. We must not forget these passages on respect and prayer were probably written at the very moment of the first persecution under Nero, or shortly after it. We thus have to say to Christians, as Paul does in Romans 13, that even though you are revolted by persecutions, even though you are ready to rebel, instead, pray for the authorities. Your only true weapon is to turn to God, for it is He alone who dispenses supreme justice. We now come to the final point. I cannot close these reflections on this passage, which unfortunately gave a wrong turn to the church and Christianity after the 3rd century, without recalling a study of some 30 years ago. The word used in this train of thought is a Greek exousia, which can mean the public authorities, but which also in New Testament another meaning being used for abstract, spiritual, religious powers. Thus Paul tells us that we are to fight against the exousia enthroned in heaven. It is thought, for example, that the angels are exousia. Oscar Cullmann and Gunther Den thus concluded that since the same word is used there, it has to be the same relation. In other words, the New Testament leads us to suppose that earthly political and military authorities really have their basis in an alliance with spiritual powers, which I will not call celestial, since they might equally be evil and demonic. The existence of these spiritual exousia will explain the universality of political powers, and also the astonishing fact that the people obeyed them as though it was self-evident. These spiritual authorities would then inspire rulers. Now, these authorities might be either good or bad, angelic or demonic. Earthly authorities reflect the powers into whose hands they have fallen. We can thus see why Paul in Romans 13 refers to the authorities that actually exist as being instituted by God, and also why some Protestant theologians could say after 1933 that Hitler was a demonized state which had fallen into the hands of a demonic power. If I say this, it is not simply because I want to say that the attitude of the first Christian generation was not absolutely unanimous, that alongside the main line according to which the state should be destroyed, there was a more nuanced line, though no one demanded unconditional obedience. The important point for me is that when Paul in Colossians 2:13-15 says that Jesus has conquered evil and death, he also says that Christ has stripped of their power all the dominions and authorities and made a public spectacle of them, and triumphing over them by the cross. In Christian thinking, the crucifixion of Christ is his true victory over all powers, both celestial and infernal. I am not saying whether they exist, but expressing the conviction of the day. For he alone has been perfectly obedient to the will of God, even accepting the scandal of his own condemnation and execution, without fully understanding it. My God, why have you abandoned me? Though he has doubts about his interpretation and mission, he has no doubts about the will of God and obeys perfectly. I know how scandalous for non-Christians is a God who demands this death, but the real question is this: how far can love go? Who will love God so absolutely as to lose himself? This was the test, stopped in time for Abraham. It was also the test that provoked the anger of Job. But Jesus alone obeyed to the very end, which he was fully free not to obey. For that reason, having loved beyond human limits, he robbed the powers of their power. Demons no longer hold sway. There are not independent exousia. All are from the very outset subject to Christ. They may revolt, of course, but they are overcome in advance. Politically, this means that the exousia which exist alongside or outside political power is also vanquished. The result is that political power is not a final court. It is always relative. We can expect from it only what is relative and open to question. This is the meaning of Paul's statement, and it shows how much we need to revitalize the traditionally absolutized formula that there is no authority except from God. Power is indeed from God, but all power is overcome in Christ.